The first bark didn't worry Officer Morgan. The second bark made him pause. But the third? The third bark had something in it. A deep, guttural urgency that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise like a warning. Ranger, his canine partner, wasn't the type to bark for nothing. He wasn't a house pet, and this wasn't some squirrel-chasing moment in the park. This was trained, calculated, persistent behavior. And it was happening in the middle of nowhere. Morgan turned his boots in the dirt and looked down the narrow, overgrown trail they'd been following for the past hour. Sunlight filtered through the early autumn trees in soft beams, and the smell of pine and dry leaves filled the crisp Missouri air. The trail wasn't on any recent map. It had been a game path once, long before the subdivision project stalled and the Coldwater Woods started swallowing it whole again. But Ranger wasn't interested in the trail. He stood at the edge of an old stone well, and he wouldn't leave it. "Easy, bud," Morgan said, walking closer. Ranger's ears twitched at his voice, but the dog didn't look away from the well. He simply gave a low, whining growl and leaned forward, sniffing the moss-covered stones at the rim. The leash tugged tight in Morgan's hand. The well was ancient, hand-laid stones covered in lichen. The wooden cross-beam up top was rotted clean through, and the bucket chain hung rusted, like an old relic someone forgot to bury. "Okay, let's check it out," Morgan muttered, more to himself than the dog. He clicked on the flashlight clipped to his vest and leaned over the edge. The beam stabbed downward into a shaft of blackness so deep it swallowed the light whole. No echo, no sound. Nothing but cold, damp air rising from the depths. "Probably dead animals," Morgan said, though the words felt hollow in his throat. Ranger didn't budge. They were supposed to be on a light patrol, just a morning check-in on the outskirts of Coldwater. Nothing special. The department had a new recruit coming in that week, and Morgan had offered to take Ranger out for a bit of exercise before the official K9 demonstrations began. But now something felt off. The kind of off that made a seasoned cop slow down and listen to his gut. Morgan reached into his pack and pulled out the small portable inspection camera they used for confined spaces. He slid it into the old bucket track and lowered it inch by inch, watching the live feed on the tiny screen. For a while, all he saw was stone, then wet earth, then nothing, until a flicker. He stopped the cable. The screen showed a momentary flash of motion. Something had moved. A shadow? A flicker of reflection? He stared, holding his breath. Then came a sound, faint, almost lost in the static. Like tapping? 3 short knocks, then silence. Back in his patrol car, Morgan radioed it in. Nothing urgent yet, just suspicious animal behavior and possible underground movement. Standard code. Nothing too crazy. Dispatch told him they'd send a crew in the afternoon. Non-emergency. He leaned back in his seat, staring at the tree line through the windshield. Something about those knocks gnawed at him. He didn't believe in ghosts. He'd buried too many friends in the desert to buy into the supernatural. But he did believe in instinct. And Ranger's tail wasn't wagging. It was rigid, alert. The way it got before things went sideways. He spent the next hour circling the area with Ranger. The dog stayed close to the well, sniffing the same patch of dirt, then barking again. Morgan marked the coordinates, snapped photos, and filled out a quick incident report. It was supposed to be routine, just another weird animal call. But as he climbed back into his vehicle, a thought dropped into his brain like a hammer. What if there's someone down there? If you're drawn to stories where animals do more than just bark at the mailman, if you believe they can sense things we can't, then you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe to Heroes for Animals for more stories where brave animals become unexpected heroes. By the time the excavation team arrived at 3:45 p.m., the sun was tilting toward the hills, casting long shadows through the woods. Morgan briefed them quickly. They brought ground sonar and thermal probes. The well was about 60 feet deep, partially collapsed in areas, but still structurally sound. The probe was lowered. 15 feet, 30 feet, 42, static. Then a spike. A heat signature, faint, but human. Everyone on site went still. One of the rescue team members swore under his breath. Another asked the question that had been burning in the back of Morgan's mind since morning. Could someone have survived down there? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Ranger barked once, short and loud. Later that evening, Morgan sat at his desk reviewing reports. A rookie came by and dropped a name on his desk. Lucas Trent. Disappeared 9 years ago, the rookie said. Journalist, investigative, cold case. Morgan stared at the grainy photo. Clean-shaven, glasses, mid-30s. A guy who asked too many questions in a town that liked things quiet. The last person to file a report on illegal land development projects in Coldwater before vanishing off the face of the earth. The location of his last known activity? Within 2 miles of the well. Morgan didn't sleep that night. He replayed the tapping sounds over and over on his phone's recorder. Listened closely. Tried to count the rhythm. Was it Morse code? 3 short knocks. Then silence. He pulled out a pen and wrote down 3 letters. SOS. The next morning, the rescue crew returned with ropes, harnesses, and a narrow-bodied technician who volunteered to descend into the well. Morgan stayed topside with Ranger, who whined and paced near the rim, ears high. 30 minutes passed. Then a voice echoed up from below. I see something! A beat. Holy shit, I think he's alive! When they pulled him up, the crowd gasped. Mud-caked skin, hollow cheeks, barely conscious, dressed in rags and clinging to a photograph pressed against his chest. Crumpled and water-stained, but still intact. It was a picture of a woman and a little girl. The name on the back said Maggie and Ella. And the year was 2015. Lucas Trent hadn't just disappeared. He'd been buried alive. The hospital room was warm, quiet, and bathed in golden evening light. But it couldn't thaw the chill crawling under Officer Morgan's skin. Lucas Trent looked like a ghost. The man lying on that hospital bed had hollowed cheeks, cracked lips, and eyes too wide, like they hadn't seen daylight in a decade. He flinched at every sudden movement. His hands, even while resting, curled into fists at his sides. Morgan stood near the foot of the bed, arms crossed, Ranger at his side. How long? Lucas's voice cracked. It had been unused for so long it barely made it out of his throat. Morgan stepped closer. You've been gone 9 years, Mr. Trent. Lucas blinked, slowly. 9 years? A nurse checked his IV, adjusting the flow of fluids. She smiled gently, but Morgan could tell even she was shaken. Nobody expected someone to be found alive after that long. Not in a well, not in Missouri, not with so little to hold on to. Morgan waited until the nurse left, then pulled a folding chair close. You know where you were? Lucas nodded, barely. In a well, in the dark, the whole time. Morgan didn't push too hard. The docs said Lucas needed rest, hydration, and time, but every officer in the station was whispering now. Coldwater hadn't had news this big since the old mill explosion in '98. Someone had tried to bury a man alive for nearly a decade, and almost succeeded. But why? And who? Lucas Trent wasn't just any missing person. He had been a reporter, an investigative journalist for the St. Louis Daily Observer. Back in 2015, he was digging deep into some development contracts in Coldwater. Land seizures, bribes, silent votes passed in private meetings, the kind of dirt that ruins lives. Morgan pulled the case file again and again. The day Lucas disappeared, he was scheduled to meet with someone named Franklin Ellis, a former zoning board official who also happened to vanish just 2 years ago. Too convenient. Too damn neat. Morgan leaned back in his desk chair, pinched the bridge of his nose, and sighed. What the hell were you on to, Lucas? The following day, Morgan returned to the woods with Ranger. They retraced the path to the old well. This time, he brought backup. 2 detectives, a forensic analyst, and a young female officer named Danny, who had grown up in Coldwater and knew the backwoods like her grandma's recipe book. It was Officer Danny who spotted it first, a strange pattern in the brush, about 40 feet west of the well. "Somebody camped here," she said, crouching low. "Not recently, though. Look at the soil compression marks, old ashes. Someone stayed here for a while, then left in a hurry." Ranger circled the area, nose to the ground. He stopped abruptly near a patch of disturbed earth, scratched twice, then barked once. Morgan knelt down. Buried in the shallow soil was a metal container, rusted, sealed, and about the size of a lunchbox. He cracked it open with a gloved hand. Inside, an old press badge, a cracked voice recorder, and several rolls of undeveloped film. The press badge read, "Lucas Trent, Observer." Back at the station, they got the film to the lab and sent the recorder off for digital recovery. Morgan stood by as the technician played back the only semi-clear audio clip. It was grainy, warped, but the voice was unmistakable. Lucas Trent, sounding nervous, spoke in a rushed whisper. "This is Trent. It's September 3rd, 2015. I'm headed to meet Franklin. He told me everything, about the land grabs, about the off-the-books money. If something happens to me, check parcel number 47B and Ellis's church files. They're hiding more than zoning corruption. It goes deeper. Way deeper." The clip ended with static. "Parcel 47B. Morgan called Danny, who was off duty but eager to help. "Ever heard of Parcel 47B? She responded immediately. "That's the old Ridgeview Baptist camp. Was sold off cheap back in 2013 to a holding company. Nobody's touched it in years. You think that's connected?" "I think we need to go," Morgan said. The next morning, they rolled out before dawn. Ranger sat in the back of the cruiser, ears perked. The Ridgeview camp was about 15 miles out of town, past the old logging roads. Overgrown, gated, forgotten. Danny unlatched the rusted gate. It creaked like something in a horror film. The place was eerie in the morning fog. Boarded-up cabins, an empty mess hall, and a moldy chapel. But it was the cellar under the chapel that made Morgan's stomach turn. It wasn't locked, just hidden. Ranger growled low as they approached. Morgan lifted his flashlight and slowly descended the stairs. The air was damp, musty, and then something else. Bleach? Why would a chapel basement smell like bleach? The flashlight beam swept over the walls. There were chains. Chains bolted to the floor. A stained mattress. Ratty blankets. A rusted tin plate. "Jesus Christ," Danny whispered behind him. They found a leather-bound folder tucked under a floorboard. Inside were photographs. Surveillance photos of Lucas, of Franklin, and even of Morgan's own police station. Names, amounts, notes about quiet payments and compliance measures. It wasn't just corruption. It was organized, deliberate, and old. Back at the hospital, Morgan visited Lucas again. He waited until the nurses left and sat down beside him, sliding the photo of Parcel 47B onto the tray table. Lucas's eyes widened. "I told them I'd go public," he whispered. "I said I had enough proof to get indictments." "You met with Franklin?" Lucas nodded. He was scared, too. He was ready to testify, but the next day, he was gone. Morgan frowned. "You think they killed him?" Lucas shook his head. "No, I think he knew too much, just like me. They locked him away somewhere deeper." Morgan's heart pounded. "Somewhere deeper?" "There are more sites," Lucas said, eyes wild now. "I heard them talking. 3 wells, 3 silos, 1 for each of us." That night, Morgan pored over county survey maps, matching them with handwritten coordinates scribbled on Lucas's recovered notes. Ranger lay on the floor nearby, alert, watching every move his handler made. Finally, it came together. 3 locations, all remote, all forgotten. 1 had just been opened. 2 were still waiting, and someone out there didn't want them found. The Coldwater precinct didn't sleep that night. Not after what Officer Morgan found under that chapel. The folder had been turned over to the state. The photos inside, crooked snapshots of Lucas Trent, Franklin Ellis, and 3 other unidentified men, were time-stamped and labeled in a rushed scrawl. There were records of off-book cash transfers, names circled in red, and notes that sounded more like blackmail than bookkeeping. Obeyed? Needs reminding. Will fold. Morgan had seen some things in his time, served 2 tours overseas, worked homicide for 6 years. But this? This was buried rot. The kind of rot that doesn't just stain, it seeps. By 6 o'clock a.m., he was back in his office with Ranger stretched on the floor beside him, paws crossed, ears flicking occasionally at the sound of passing boots. The room was dim, except for the light from the desk lamp, which illuminated an old county zoning map spread across the surface. 3 pins, 3 locations. One confirmed the well where Lucas Trent had been found. The second, Ridgeview Baptist Camp, matched Parcel 47B. But the third? Morgan stared at the red X scrawled in the lower corner. The handwriting wasn't Lucas's. It matched the writing from the black folder. Tight, capitalized, angry. He traced it with his finger. Dry Creek Grain Silo. Abandoned. The silo sat nearly 30 miles south of Coldwater. Built in the 70s, shut down in the early 2000s after the crop subsidy cuts. It was supposed to be demolished 5 years ago, but the paperwork never went through. Morgan made the call himself. No backup? Not yet. He wanted eyes on it first. He loaded Ranger into the cruiser, checked his gear, and hit the road. The sun was barely up. The air felt too still. Dry Creek wasn't a town anymore, just a memory held up by 3 rusted mailboxes and a sagging church steeple. The silo stood like a forgotten giant on the edge of a cracked service road, surrounded by tall, uncut grass and a perimeter fence barely holding together. Morgan parked just outside the gate, popped the trunk, and clipped Ranger's leash to his vest. The dog was already alert, ears high, tail stiff. They approached the silo slowly, crunching gravel underfoot. A faded sign flapped weakly against the chain link. Condemned, do not enter. Morgan snorted. Guess we're not feeling very obedient today. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint scent of mildew. Rusted machinery lined the walls, and old grain husks littered the floor like confetti from a long-dead harvest. Ranger sniffed the ground, his pace quickening. Morgan followed him around a half-collapsed conveyor chute and toward the far end of the structure. That's when he saw it. A trapdoor. Newer wood. Less dust. Morgan crouched. There were fresh scratches in the paint. Faint but visible. Like someone had tried to claw their way out. His throat tightened. He radioed in. Unit 14 requesting emergency response at Dry Creek Silo. Possible second victim. Location appears active. Repeat, this site is not cold. Is. Copy that 14, dispatch answered. Your ETA for backup is 27 minutes. That would be too late if what Morgan feared was true. He unlatched the trapdoor and pulled it open. The smell hit him first. Rot, sweat, mold, and something else. Bleach again. Like someone had tried to sanitize, but failed. A metal ladder descended into darkness. Ranger whined low, pacing at the edge. Morgan clipped a flashlight to his vest and started down. The chamber below was narrow, claustrophobic. A dirt floor, low concrete walls, and a single chain looped around a pipe on the far end. At first it looked empty. Then Morgan saw the figure, curled in the corner, pale, thin, breathing. He rushed over, heart pounding. The man was unconscious, maybe sedated. A full beard, matted hair, a deep scar across his jawline. A chain was padlocked around his ankle. Morgan keyed his radio again. Confirmed. Male victim found, alive. Unknown ID. Immediate medical needed. As he leaned in closer, the man stirred, mumbling. Is it Tuesday? The voice rasped. Morgan swallowed hard. What's your name? The man blinked slowly, lips cracked. Franklin. By the time backup arrived, Morgan had cut the chain and carried Franklin Ellis up the ladder himself. Ranger stayed close, as if guarding them both. EMS loaded him into the ambulance, and Morgan stood outside the silo, watching the sun rise higher over the wheat fields beyond. The quiet was suffocating. That made two victims, Lucas and Franklin, both silenced, both dumped in forgotten corners of the county like trash. But now they were talking, and that terrified someone. Back at the station, Lucas was finally strong enough to sit up in bed. Morgan brought him a styrofoam cup of black coffee and slid into the seat beside him. "We found him," Morgan said. Lucas's head turned sharply. "Franklin? Yeah, alive, just alive, just like you." Lucas let out a breath he'd been holding for nearly a decade. His hand shook as he gripped the coffee. They said he cracked, that he told them everything." Morgan nodded slowly. "He might have." Lucas's eyes darkened. Then we're both dead men walking. Later that night, Morgan sat in his apartment, staring at the TV without hearing a word. Ranger lay curled on the rug, but every few minutes his ears twitched, always listening. Morgan's laptop sat open on the coffee table, screen glowing. He clicked open the old zoning archive from 2014, Parcel 49C, the last red X. He zoomed in. It wasn't a well. It wasn't a church. It was a storage unit, a private facility just outside of town, still registered to a shell corporation, still locked up. Morgan picked up his phone and made a call to Officer Danny. "You up for one more?" he asked. She didn't hesitate. "Always." The next morning, the two officers arrived at the unit. It was tucked behind a used tire shop, surrounded by rusting storage lockers and barbed wire fencing. The gate was unlocked. Too easy. Morgan's gut twisted. They approached slowly. Unit 12B, padlocked but scratched. Ranger stopped dead at the door. Then he growled, low, deep. The kind of growl that came from the ancient part of a dog's brain. The part that remembered wolves, predators, and danger. Morgan exchanged a look with Danny. She nodded. "Let's open it." The padlock snapped open with a soft click that somehow echoed louder than a gunshot in the early morning quiet. Officer Morgan slid it into his jacket pocket and paused. Beside him, Officer Danny kept one hand on her sidearm. Her eyes stayed on the rusted metal door of Unit 12B like she expected it to grow teeth. Behind them, Ranger's growl rumbled again. Low, primal. It wasn't a bark for attention. It was a warning. "Ready?" Morgan asked. Danny nodded. "Let's do it." Morgan gripped the handle, braced his boot at the bottom for leverage, and yanked. The door rattled upward, groaning on old rollers, and the darkness inside yawned open like the mouth of something ancient and starving. At first it looked like nothing, just another storage unit full of dust, cobwebs, and broken junk. But then Ranger stepped forward, nose twitching furiously. He moved quickly, stopping at a large tarp draped over something square and tall in the back corner. Morgan followed, flashlight slicing through the gloom. He pulled the tarp back. What he saw made his breath hitch. It was a chair, but not just any chair. It was bolted to a steel plate on the ground, surrounded by padded walls and fitted with old leather restraints, the kind you'd see in an asylum. On the floor beside it, a dusty handheld recorder sat upright like someone had placed it down carefully and never returned. Morgan crouched and pressed play. The tape crackled. Then a voice, shaky, broken. "My name is Gary Phelps. If someone finds this, I want my family to know I didn't run. I didn't disappear. I was taken. I don't know where I am anymore. Time doesn't mean anything here. But they keep talking about obedience, about punishment. I think I knew too much. Maybe it's my fault. Maybe..." The recording fizzled into static. Danny stepped back, her face pale. "That name, Gary Phelps. He was a city contractor, right? Missing since 28. Morgan nodded, standing slowly. "That's 3, he said. 3 missing men, 3 different professions, all locked away." Morgan and Danny photographed everything, bagged the recorder, took fingerprints, dust samples, and hair follicles off the restraints. They didn't speak much. There wasn't much to say. Whoever was behind this wasn't just silencing threats. They were storing them. Back at the station, Chief Hendricks stared at the evidence laid out on the table with a haunted look in his eyes. "You think it goes higher?" he asked. Morgan didn't answer right away. Then, Lucas Trent said the well wasn't the only one, and he thought there might be others still buried, still waiting. This wasn't a series of random disappearances. This was coordinated. Coordinated by who? Morgan met his gaze. "That's what I'm about to find out." They moved fast. Search warrants were filed that day. Franklin Ellis, still recovering in the hospital, confirmed details about zoning files, secret meetings, and one name that kept popping up in every corner of this case: Earl Bowman, Coldwater's former mayor, retired 3 years ago. On the surface, he was squeaky clean. Vietnam vet, churchgoer, still showed up to cut ribbons at school fundraisers. But his fingerprints were all over land transfers involving Parcel 47B, Ridgeview Camp, and yes, even the Dry Creek silo. The problem? Earl Bowman was untouchable. No convictions, no arrests, no red flags. But Morgan had something else. He had Ranger. That afternoon, Morgan took the K-9 unit to a local charity event where Bowman was scheduled to appear. It was a small gathering, just a ribbon cutting for a new park playground funded by Bowman's nonprofit. Kids ran between swings and climbing ropes, while the former mayor posed for photos in his navy blazer and American flag lapel pin. Morgan walked past him once, slow, nonchalant. Ranger stayed tight at his side. Then, just as they passed again, Ranger lunged. He didn't bark, didn't growl, just locked eyes with Bowman and pulled toward him hard, nose high, tail stiff. "Alert! Target sent!" Bowman's smile faltered. Morgan nodded once, almost to himself. He'd seen this before. Ranger had picked up something. Something bad. An hour later, Morgan filed a formal request to review Bowman's nonprofit's tax records. And thanks to a lucky tip from Danny, whose cousin worked in municipal records, they found the smoking gun. A deed transfer, filed under a shell company. It gave the Bowman Foundation full control of a decommissioned water treatment facility 3 miles outside of town. Same dates, same funding flow, same silence. They hit the building the next day. SWAT, local deputies, even a federal observer from the DOJ. Morgan rode up front with Ranger in the lead vehicle, heart hammering against his vest. This wasn't routine anymore. This was exposure. Truth. The facility was old, fenced, and supposedly abandoned. But the locks were new. Cameras were hidden in the floodlights. And the doors? Steel reinforced. They breached at 4:07 a.m. The team moved room to room. Dust, mold, empty desks. Then they reached the sub-basement and found the rooms. 6 of them, each no bigger than a janitor's closet. Each one with a standard door. Inside were 5 men, weak, malnourished, but alive. One of them wore a stained postal uniform. Another had been a school teacher. A third, a man who'd been declared dead in 2011. The 6th room, it was empty, except for a chair bolted to the floor and a phrase carved into the back wall. Silence is safety. They arrested Bowman that night. He didn't resist, just stared blankly ahead as Morgan cuffed him in front of local news cameras. He offered no statement, no emotion, just a strange, subtle smile, like he knew this day would come eventually, like he welcomed it. Back at the precinct, Morgan watched the rescued men get loaded into ambulances. Lucas and Franklin both stood near the edge of the sidewalk, watching in stunned silence. "They're gonna need time," Morgan said quietly. "Yeah," Franklin replied, "but at least they have it now." Ranger sat beside them, tail wagging gently, watching it all unfold. Another job done, another voice heard. As the sun rose behind the courthouse, Morgan looked at the report stacked on his desk. 6 survivors, 3 dead, 1 orchestrator, and 1 dog who never stopped barking until the truth came out. Earl Bowman didn't say a word. Not when they booked him, not during the fingerprinting, not when they asked where the other victims were, or how many more might still be out there. He sat stone still in the interrogation room at Coldwater PD. His weathered hands folded neatly in front of him on the table, his gaze fixed on some invisible point in the corner. Officer Morgan had seen hardened criminals break down after a few hours under fluorescent lights. Not Bowman. He just smiled and said nothing. Chief Hendricks stood in the observation room, arms folded, his jaw tight. "You're sure this is the guy?" Morgan didn't even look away from the two-way mirror. "He owns the land. He signed the transfers. He was the last known contact for 3 of the missing men. We found 6 victims under his watch." "And so still no confession?" "Not a word." Ranger lay by the observation window, eyes locked on the man behind the glass. Not growling, not barking, just watching. Same as Morgan, same as everyone in Coldwater now. The town was unraveling. The story broke the moment Bowman's mugshot hit local news. Suddenly, neighbors were remembering odd construction noises in the night. Forgotten properties now looked suspicious. People were calling in with stories about missing relatives, strange donations, hushed church meetings, and fear, real bone-deep fear. Because Bowman hadn't just hurt people, he'd convinced the town to look the other way while he did it. Morgan walked out of the precinct at dusk, exhaustion dragging behind him like a heavy coat. The wind was sharp, the sky gray. Across the parking lot, reporters had started forming a line behind the yellow tape barrier. Cameras. Boom mics. Questions he couldn't yet answer. "Officer Morgan, did the K-9 unit find all the victims? Do you believe this was a cult? What about the church funding? Was that laundered money?" He said nothing. Ranger stayed close, his presence both calming and protective. They climbed into the cruiser. Morgan didn't start the engine right away. Instead, he sat in the silence and stared out at the darkened horizon. "Feels like we only cracked the top layer," he muttered to the dog. Ranger wagged his tail gently. That night, Morgan couldn't sleep. He sat in his living room with a beer going flat on the coffee table, maps spread out across the floor, and Ranger dozing on the rug nearby. Lucas Trent had gone quiet again. Trauma fatigue, the doctors called it. Franklin Ellis was refusing interviews. The surviving victims at the water treatment facility had been moved to a trauma center out of state. Everyone wanted to forget, but Morgan couldn't. He picked up the file that had arrived anonymously earlier that day. No return address, just a plain envelope with 3 things inside: a photo, a set of GPS coordinates, and a single note. Written in shaky handwriting, the 7th didn't make it. The coordinates led to an old storm shelter on the edge of an abandoned farm 20 minutes north of town. It wasn't on any current zoning maps. The aerial image showed nothing but weeds and rusted-out fencing. Morgan didn't wait. He loaded Ranger into the cruiser at 4:30 a.m. and drove in silence, headlights cutting through the morning mist. No sirens, no backup. Just him, his dog, and a gut feeling that something terrible was waiting. The storm shelter was buried under 2 feet of overgrowth. Ranger found it first, sniffed it out from 20 yards away, and began barking sharply, circling the patch of grass until his paws dug into old concrete. Morgan knelt beside him and yanked at the rusted handle. The door creaked open reluctantly. Inside was a narrow staircase descending into blackness. The smell hit hard. Death. Old death. Not recent. Still, Morgan descended with his flashlight high, his heart in his throat. At the bottom was a small room. 1 cot, 1 bucket, a small plastic bag of belongings long rotted through, and a body, male, skeletal, positioned like he had sat down to wait and never stood again. On the wall behind him, carved deep into the concrete with what looked like a spoon, were the words, "I told the truth, that was my mistake." Morgan stood in the shelter for a long time. He didn't move, didn't cry, didn't curse. He just stared at the message and thought about the hundreds of other people out there, whistleblowers, journalists, good men and women, who'd tried to shine a light on darkness and paid for it in blood. Then he looked at Ranger, who sat at the top of the steps, waiting, loyal, steady, a silent sentinel who wouldn't leave until the last secret was uncovered. Back at the station, Morgan entered the shelter's GPS coordinates into the cold case database. The body matched a man named Ron Whitaker, an environmental scientist who vanished in 2012 after accusing the county of falsifying groundwater safety reports tied to a development firm. One linked to Bowman's campaign fund. The seventh victim. Confirmed. Morgan added the name to the list, posted it on the board. Another face, another story, another man the system forgot. Not anymore. As Morgan turned to leave, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered. A voice on the other end, low, gravelly. You've done enough, officer. Let this rest. Click. No name, no location, just a warning. The following day, Morgan submitted an official request to transfer the investigation to the DOJ. He also filed for an extended leave. When Chief Hendricks raised an eyebrow, Morgan just shrugged. This thing's too big for one badge. The chief didn't argue. That weekend, Morgan stood outside the Coldwater Kind Training Center with rangers seated beside him, tail wagging gently. The town had come out in full. Families, school kids, retirees with lawn chairs, and homemade signs that read, "Thank you, Ranger," and "Coldwater's real hero." Morgan stepped up to the mic under a bright blue sky. Sometimes, he said, the truth gets buried. Sometimes it gets locked away or shut behind steel doors. And sometimes, the only one willing to dig it up is the one who can't speak. He reached Tremyon and patted Ranger gently behind the ears.
This dog didn't just sniff out crime. He sniffed out history, secrets, injustice.
He looked out over the crowd, eyes narrowed just slightly. And if anyone out there thinks that kind of truth can stay buried, he paused. You've got no idea how good this dog's nose really is. The road out of Coldwater was long, straight, and quiet. Sunlight spilled over the horizon in streaks of gold, casting long shadows across the wheat fields. Officer Morgan sat behind the wheel of his department cruiser, one hand resting on the steering wheel, the other idly reaching back to scratch Ranger behind the ear. The German Shepherd didn't move much, just gave a satisfied grunt and blinked slowly, his chin resting on the center console. They were both tired. But it was the kind of tired that came after doing something that mattered. Morgan had handed over the case. The Department of Justice took full control of the investigation, and within 72 hours, they'd frozen assets, issued indictments, and kicked open doors from Missouri to Washington, D.C. What started in a forgotten well had rippled all the way to the Capitol. Bowman wasn't acting alone. Turns out he was the tip of a rotten iceberg. City developers, zoning commissioners, corporate heads, they were all part of it. A quiet agreement to silence the ones who spoke too loudly, to make people disappear when they threatened the system. But not anymore, because a dog wouldn't walk away. Morgan turned off onto a gravel road about 20 miles north of Coldwater. The air smelled like cedar and wild clover. Birds chirped in the trees, and a mailbox half covered in vines read, Whitaker Family Cemetery, private property. He parked under the shade of an old elm and stepped out. Ranger followed close behind, tail low, body calm. Morgan walked slowly between the rows of small headstones. Some were chipped, some sunken, but all lovingly cared for. He stopped at one near the back, newer than the rest. It read, Ron Whitaker, 1973-2012. I told the truth. That was my mistake. Someone had carved the quote from the storm shelter right into the stone. Morgan crouched, brushing a few stray leaves from the base. He pulled a small pin from his shirt pocket, Coldwater PD, K-9 Division, and placed it gently at the foot of the marker. No one's going to forget anymore, he said softly. Not after this. Ranger sat beside him, ears perked, eyes locked on the gravestone with that eerie sense dogs always seem to have. Like they understand shit more than they let on. The ride back was quiet. No radio, no static, just the hum of the road and the occasional bump of gravel under the tires. Morgan didn't need noise anymore. His head was full enough. Faces, Voices. Names: Lucas Trent, Franklin Ellie, Ron Whitaker, Gary Phelps, and the others. The ones who survived and the ones who didn't. All silenced. Until now. 2 days later, the mayor's office held a public ceremony at City Hall. Hundreds gathered, not to honor politicians, but to honor a dog. The department presented Ranger with the Medal of Civil Valor, the highest award they could give an officer, canine or human. Morgan didn't give a speech this time. He just stood on stage with Ranger at his side and nodded at the applause, one hand on the leash, the other clutching a framed photo of the well in the woods, the place where it all began. That well would be turned into a memorial, a stone plaque, a bench, a small garden planted by local school children, and a bronze statue of a dog, standing tall, ears forward, paw lifted. It would say, "Ranger, he never walked away." That night, Morgan finally took Ranger home for good. No more early patrols. No more training drills. Just slow mornings, long hikes, and naps in the sun. The department offered to give him a new partner, but he politely declined. Ranger did enough for 10 lifetimes, he said. Instead, he built a fenced-in yard behind his cabin in the woods, put in a dog door, started working part-time for a local veteran outreach program, helping soldiers adjust to civilian life with the help of service dogs. He told Ranger's story 100 times, each one a little different, each one a little harder to finish without choking up. Months passed. Coldwater healed, slowly. The church reopened under new leadership. The victims got counseling and housing. A community fund was started in their names. Kids wrote letters. Schools taught local history a little differently. And every so often, someone would stop Morgan at the gas station or post office. They'd say, "Hey, you're the guy with that hero dog, right?" And he'd smile, shake their hand, and reply, "No, I'm just the guy who kept up." One fall afternoon, Morgan and Ranger sat at the edge of a trail overlooking the hills, a light breeze rustling the trees. The sun dipped low, casting a golden hue across the valley. Ranger stood, sniffed the air, then looked at Morgan, like he was remembering, or maybe just letting go. Morgan reached down, scratched behind his ears, and whispered, "We did good, buddy." Ranger leaned into the touch, and for the first time in a long time, Morgan felt light, like maybe justice had a pulse again. And it beat quietly, under dusty boots and muddy paws, in forgotten places most people never thought to look. Thank you for following this journey. We told the story of a dog who never gave up, and a man who chose to listen when others turned away. But now, I want to ask you something. What would you do if the only voice speaking the truth couldn't speak at all? Would you stop to listen, like Morgan did? Or would you walk away like everyone else had? Let us know in the comments. And if stories like these move you, subscribe to Heroes for Animals for more real and fictional tales where the silent become the saviors. We appreciate you, and we'll see you in the next story.